Hi there, curious people. Thanks for joining me for another episode in the Barnum Museum series, Curious People Wanted. Today will be a bit different from our other episodes because I have a special guest to introduce. But first, if this is your first time seeing this series, my name is Adrienne St. Pierre, and I'm the curator here at the Barnum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And now I'd like to introduce our guest, who is none other than Mr. P.T. Barnum. So happy to have you here today, Mr. Barnum. This is quite a treat. I couldn't help but notice your employee ID badge from Bridgeport Hospital. Wow. So given that your initials are PT, did you happen to work in the physical therapy center? Oh, that makes sense. I'm sure you made everyone feel better. That's just part of your philosophy. The noblest art is that of making others happy, right? Well, thanks for stopping by. Your timing couldn't have been better because I was just thinking that people might like to know about your role in establishing Bridgeport's first hospital. I suspect there are very few people who would imagine that a famous showman and circus impresario like you was instrumental in founding a modern hospital and serving as its president. I know that was a long time ago. Remind me, what was the year? 1878. Well, that's approaching, 150 years ago now. Long time. Well, Mr. Barnum, I know you're a very busy man who has a jumbo-sized schedule, so do you mind if I share your story with our audience today? I'd also like to show everyone a photograph of you that was taken by the famous Matthew Brady studio. It's pretty cool, and it dates to about the time that you were involved in the hospital planning. Thanks for stopping by. See you soon. As some of you know, Bridgeport, Connecticut was P.T. Barnum's adopted hometown, though it was not his birthplace. He and his wife and daughters first moved to Bridgeport in the 1840s when it was still a young city. There were only 4,500 people at the beginning of that decade, but it was growing apace, and that size was really something back then. Barnum thought Bridgeport's location was pretty ideal, and because it was a young city, he wanted to see it develop in ways that would make it livable for its residents. That would be things we call infrastructure and amenities, a healthy place with parks, clean water, street lights, and opportunities for working people to become homeowners. Barnum's experience living in New York City would certainly have shown him that living conditions for working and poor people there were rough at best and frequently wretched, not a place for working families to flourish. So Barnum made it his mission to advance the development in Bridgeport in ways that it would make it into a fine city. And you can discover more about his various civic endeavors in one of our Showman's Shorts videos. Barnum became the city's mayor in 1875, and it was right about that time that a plan began in earnest to build a modern hospital. Of course, Barnum was instrumental in making that happen, although the credit for initiating the plan begins elsewhere. The story starts with a Bridgeport man, a young doctor named George Frederick Lewis, who attended Yale in the early 1860s, but was soon called into service in the Civil War. As a military cadet, he was assigned to work at a hospital in Ohio. After the war, he returned to Bridgeport, and he saw how rapidly it was growing. The population was just under 20,000 people in 1870. And again, that doesn't sound so large today, but that was a 50% increase in just a decade, and there was no sign of it slowing down. Having had the experience of working in a hospital in Ohio, but now in private practice, George Lewis felt that a city the size of Bridgeport really should have a proper hospital to serve its residents. This was around the time when Florence Nightingale's essays on hospital reform were published, and they were being read by doctors all over. And so this was the beginning of a movement towards establishing public hospitals that follow these principles. In Bridgeport, what had passed for a hospital in the 1860s and 70s was merely a basement space in a downtown building. This was used for emergency treatment and sometimes to treat poor people who were ill. In that era, and of course for centuries prior, the general sentiment was that people who were ill should be treated and cared for in their own homes. So it wasn't as if the general public was clamoring for a hospital at the time Dr. Lewis began hatching his idea. He himself did not have the means to build a hospital, but he had an aunt who was financially well off, and he convinced her to bequeath a sum of money for this purpose. Well, his aunt, Susan Hubble, died a few years later in 1874, and in her will she had bequeathed $13,500 plus 1 acre of land at the top of Mill Hill for the construction of a hospital. By the way, locating a hospital on a hill was a wise thing to do back in those days for health reasons, so her gift of that acre was in itself significant. $13,500 might not sound like a huge amount today, but the gift, of course, would be equivalent to much, much larger amounts today. Unfortunately, it's impossible to say exactly how much, as you can't calculate meaningful equivalencies when you go back before the early 1900s. In any case, Mrs. Hubble's gift prompted young Dr. Lewis to find other philanthropic individuals who would support the plan and donate money to build a hospital. And you guessed it, Mayor P.T. Barnum was quickly on board that bandwagon to drum up interest. Perhaps Barnum's advocacy and promotional skills helped change public opinion about the need, because, in fact, residents throughout the city gave money to the cause. For example, one Sunday, many of the churches in Fairfield County donated the money that people put in their collection plates. Businesses contributed as well, and the state of Connecticut matched what they raised with a grant of $50,000. Altogether, $144,000 was raised to build the Bridgeport Hospital, and that was quite a lot of money in that era. 4 years after Susan Hubble's bequest jump-started the project, Bridgeport Hospital was incorporated with a board of directors and P.T. Barnum at the helm as the chair. This was in 1878, and he was no longer mayor then, but he was serving in the Connecticut General Assembly. And he encouraged the members to accept articles of incorporation for a public hospital to be built in or near the city of Bridgeport. Barnum remained chairman of the board of directors until his death in 1891. Now, the board was composed of a dozen men, no surprise, but notably, they named 3 women as the official founders of Bridgeport Hospital. Susan Hubble, of course, and the other 2 were Catherine Burroughs Pettingill and Frances Elizabeth Pomeroy. In total, the 3 women had given $38,500 plus the parcel of land. After more land was purchased, and you'll see why in a minute, the building of the hospital began in 1883. The layout was modeled after 2 other hospitals, one being Johns Hopkins, and the design incorporated many of Florence Nightingale's recommendations. The construction was closely supervised by Dr. Lewis, and in 1884, Bridgeport's first public hospital opened on Grant Street on the city's east side. Its 48 beds were available to people who lived in the surrounding towns, as well as those who were residents of Bridgeport. And the total cost was $120,508. Dr. Lewis took the helm as the supervisor of a medical staff of 15, and soon they added a hospital training school for nurses. Now, given the way we envision hospitals today, I think you may be interested to hear that Bridgeport Hospital had its own herd of cattle, plus gardens and fruit trees, and it had a stable and shed for the horse-drawn carriage that bore the hospital's name, hence the need for more than that 1 acre of land that had been donated. Another thing that was quite different from today, the doctor's services were free. You may be wondering how much Barnum himself donated. According to his will, he had previously made a gift of $5,000, and he bequeathed another $5,000 to endow a bed at the hospital. So from that, we know he gave at least $10,000. Now, I have a couple of things to show you here. One is a little booklet and portfolio that the Bridgeport Hospital Foundation put out probably in, let's say, the 1990s. At that time, they were establishing the 1878 Society, and this booklet was sent to potential donors to encourage charter membership in the society. It's quite a handsome piece, and I love that the design includes the images of these 5 signatures: Susan Hubble, Dr. George Lewis, Catherine Burroughs Pettingill, Francis Pomeroy, and then the last one here is P.T. Barnum. These are the 5 who were instrumental in establishing the hospital. Now, inside the cover, you see they included a photograph of Barnum. And what I'd like to show you is the glass plate negative from which that image was taken. The museum acquired this glass negative just a couple of years ago. It's a double image, as you can see a little bit. And although at first glance the 2 images appear to be identical, they are actually slightly different. I believe this was taken with a double lens camera to get 2 slightly different angles. The reason for doing that was so that the images could be turned into a stereo view card. This is an example of one here. When you looked through a stereoscope, you would see this image as one in 3D. And this was a popular home entertainment in the 19th century, from the 1860s well into the 20th century. Now, the man who owned this glass negative prior to the museum, Hans Lorenz, was a professional photographer. He worked for a museum in Virginia, and he had a great interest in early photography. When he acquired the negative, he did some research to see if he could find a published print version of this identical to the negative. Well, he did this because it's an important piece. It's attributed to the studio of the famous Matthew Brady. And as a matter of fact, Brady's studio is located diagonally across from Barnum's American Museum. You'd think that this image would have been published and would be out there somewhere, but according to an article Mr. Lorenz wrote, he never found one, so perhaps that negative was never used. In any case, he decided to make positive prints from the glass negative. And here's what that looks like. It's very clear and sharp. It's a good, strong image. And it likely dates to the 1870s, so say when Barnum was in his 60s. We do not know at this point how it came about that the Bridgeport Hospital Foundation asked to use the image in the 1990s. We're not sure what the connection was there. Perhaps it was a personal connection. But whatever the story, it was a good choice for their print piece because it nicely depicts Barnum around the time those first hospital discussions were taking place. P.T. Barnum and Dr. Lewis's determination to make a public hospital a reality and the very generous financial contributions of 3 women in the community are a healing story indeed. I hope you've enjoyed learning about this facet of Barnum's civic life and his role in developing Bridgeport. It's another bit of history that adds to our understanding of his unflagging desire to make ordinary people's lives better. And not only through entertainment, though one might say that laughter is the best medicine. Thanks for joining me today. Stay curious, and I will see you again for another episode of Curious People Wanted. Take care.